You may wonder, what is the one thing that can actually make a narcissist apologize? The same person who once looked you in the eyes and insisted your pain did not matter can suddenly seem willing to admit fault. Surprisingly, it is not because you begged them. It is not because you carefully explained your feelings again and again. The real shift comes from something much quieter and far more powerful. The moment you make this change, their confidence begins to weaken. Their certainty starts falling apart, and they may return with the closest version of accountability they are capable of showing. Stay with me, because what comes next explains why this happens and why so many people misunderstand it. People with strong narcissistic traits rarely apologize because they suddenly develop deep empathy. Empathy is usually not what drives the way they handle relationships. Instead, they are motivated by attention, validation, admiration, influence, and control. When they hurt someone, they often do not focus on the emotional damage they caused. Their attention usually turns toward themselves. They ask, even if only subconsciously, whether the situation threatens their reputation, their comfort, their access to what they want, or the image they have created for themselves. If none of those things are at risk, there is often little motivation to feel genuine remorse. Their emotional focus naturally leans toward protecting themselves instead of building healthy emotional connection, which helps explain why they can seem surprisingly cold even while someone else is deeply hurting. But everything begins to shift the moment their own behavior creates consequences they can no longer ignore. Once you stop giving them your attention, stop participating in endless arguments, stop defending your feelings, and remove the emotional energy that once kept the cycle alive, they experience a major interruption in the validation they depended on. That interruption, not sudden compassion, is what gets their attention. This is why apologies often appear only when they sense they are losing access to you. When you become unavailable, or when their influence over your emotions starts fading, they begin realizing their actions now carry a personal cost. And if there is one thing they strongly dislike, it is facing emotional consequences. Their apology is often transactional rather than deeply heartfelt. It becomes a strategy to regain stability instead of a true reflection of emotional understanding. As soon as you stop acting as the emotional support they relied upon, they begin sensing real risk. That risk may involve losing you completely, losing admiration, losing daily comfort, or damaging the self-image they work so hard to protect. To reduce that risk, they may offer words that sound like accountability. However, this usually does not mean they have suddenly developed empathy. More often, they are trying to recover something valuable they believe is slipping away. That is why calmly withdrawing your emotional energy often has a much stronger effect than confronting them with intense emotion. Your silence clearly shows them that their influence is fading. For someone who depends on attention and control, that realization feels deeply uncomfortable. The apology that sometimes follows is often an attempt to restore the balance that benefits them the most. Your calm distance becomes more effective than emotional confrontation because people with these patterns often respond more to emotional intensity than to emotional understanding. When you react with anger, tears, long explanations, or desperate attempts to make them change, you may believe you are finally expressing your pain. What they often notice instead is your continued engagement. To them, that engagement confirms they still occupy an important place in your emotional world. It tells them they still affect your thoughts, your feelings, and your daily life. Even negative reactions can reinforce their sense of influence because every emotional response reminds them they still have access to your attention. On the other hand, choosing emotional distance creates an entirely different situation, one they are often unprepared to face. The moment you stop reacting, speak with calm confidence, and no longer feel the need to convince them of your point of view, the pattern they relied on begins to fall apart. You are no longer a dependable source of validation or emotional excitement. You become emotionally neutral, and that neutrality is one of the hardest things for them to deal with. Emotional withdrawal is not the same as giving someone the silent treatment, nor is it a form of punishment. It simply means stepping away from the role they have always expected you to play. Instead of begging for fairness, you remain calm and focus on facts. Instead of explaining yourself over and over, you keep your words clear and brief. Instead of getting pulled into endless arguments, you quietly protect your boundaries and preserve your emotional energy. By doing this, you remove yourself from the cycle of conflict that once helped them feel powerful or in control. People with strong narcissistic traits often depend on emotional reactions to maintain their sense of influence. They may intentionally provoke you to keep you emotionally unsettled. They criticize you, hoping you will defend yourself. They use guilt, so you feel obligated to justify every decision you make. When you stop responding emotionally, you take away the very reactions that supported their sense of control. Suddenly, they are placed in an uncomfortable position. They can no longer read your emotions with confidence. They cannot predict your next move. Guilt, charm, intimidation, or emotional pressure no longer pull you back into the same pattern. They lose the ability to provoke the reactions they once expected. Your calm becomes deeply unsettling because they often view emotional detachment as a sign they are losing influence. They begin wondering if their control is slipping away. That hidden uncertainty can eventually push them toward behaviors they normally avoid, including offering an apology. Even then, the apology is often less about understanding your pain and more about restoring the emotional connection they believe they are losing. Your emotional distance quietly tells them they no longer affect you the way they once did, and that loss of influence becomes the pressure that encourages different behavior. Still, boundaries only have real value when they are supported by consistent action. Simply talking about your limits is rarely enough. People with narcissistic patterns tend to respond more to consequences than to emotional conversations. You can repeat the same boundary countless times, but if you continue accepting the same behavior, those words lose their meaning. They will often test your limits again and again, watching closely to see whether your no truly means no, or whether it can be weakened through guilt, manipulation, pressure, or persistence. The moment they notice inconsistency, they often take it as permission to continue. That is why healthy boundaries must remain calm, firm, and consistent. Otherwise, they become opportunities for further manipulation instead of genuine protection. When your actions support your words, everything begins to change. Rather than trying to convince them why their behavior is harmful, you simply adjust your response. If they begin yelling, you calmly leave the conversation. If they insult you, you end the interaction. If they repeatedly ignore a clear boundary, you reduce their access to your time and attention. The most important part is following through every single time. They often apply pressure because they expect you to give in eventually. When you remain steady instead, you interrupt the pattern they counted on. Your consistency challenges their sense of entitlement and shows them that the methods which once worked no longer have the same effect. Holding firm boundaries over time also changes you in a powerful way. You stop making decisions based on fear, guilt, or old emotional habits. Instead, your choices begin coming from a place of confidence and self-respect. That shift creates a much healthier environment where you no longer reward unhealthy behavior with endless attention, emotional debates, or constant engagement. People with strong narcissistic traits are often unfamiliar with this kind of steady consistency. They are used to repeating the same cycle. They provoke, you react. Then they regain the upper hand. A calm, unwavering boundary breaks that pattern completely. Over time, they begin recognizing that certain behaviors now lead to real consequences. Those consequences might be greater distance, silence, limited communication, or even losing the influence they once counted on. That realization can sometimes lead them to apologize or temporarily change how they behave. However, this usually happens not because they fully understand your boundary, but because your consistency finally creates a personal cost for actions that previously carried none. Boundaries supported by action make it clear that you are no longer someone who can easily be manipulated or pulled back into familiar, unhealthy patterns. One of the greatest fears for someone with narcissistic traits is losing access, admiration, or influence. These things often become the foundation of how they view themselves and maintain their sense of importance. Instead of seeing relationships as equal emotional partnerships, They may see them as sources of attention, validation, praise, or practical benefit. As long as those sources remain available, they often feel confident and secure. But when that access begins to disappear, their inner stability can quickly weaken. This helps explain why they may sometimes appear arrogant, dismissive, or unusually harsh. They often assume you will always remain available, continue forgiving them, explain your feelings repeatedly, and tolerate behavior that crosses healthy boundaries. They depend heavily on your emotional investment because it reinforces their sense of control and significance. The moment that investment becomes uncertain, they may experience deep anxiety, even if they never admit it. Losing access means they can no longer influence your daily life as they once did. Losing admiration means they are no longer viewed as exceptional or superior. Losing influence means your emotions are no longer responding to their actions the way they once expected. These changes strike at the heart of their self-image because many rely heavily on outside validation instead of developing lasting inner security. When you stop reacting emotionally, become more detached, and no longer respond in familiar ways, they may begin fearing that they are becoming irrelevant in your life. That fear often causes them to quickly change their approach. They may suddenly seem apologetic, unusually kind, or far more attentive than before. Some even try to recreate the early stage of the relationship when everything felt exciting and ideal, hoping to pull you back into the same cycle. Their apology is often driven less by genuine empathy and more by fear of losing their place in your world. They sense that emotional distance could eventually become permanent distance, and that possibility feels threatening. The apology becomes an attempt to restore access, regain influence, and secure the attention they depended on. This same fear explains why they often react strongly when they notice your independence, emotional stability, and self-respect growing. To them, these qualities can signal that you are no longer under their emotional influence. As admiration and access continue fading, an internal alarm is triggered, encouraging them to do whatever they believe might restore their position, including offering an apology motivated more by self-preservation than true accountability. Calm emotional detachment is often much more unsettling to them than open anger because they tend to thrive on emotional intensity and predictable reactions. When you respond with frustration, sadness, or anger, you are still participating in the emotional dynamic. Even if you believe you are standing up for yourself, every emotional outburst or desperate attempt to be understood can reinforce the idea that they still have an effect on your thoughts and emotions. They often see your emotional intensity as proof that they still matter to you, that they continue to have influence, and that the familiar cycle is still working exactly as they expected. Anger may increase the conflict, but it rarely creates lasting change because it keeps you playing by the rules of a dynamic they understand well. As long as you remain emotionally reactive, they still receive confirmation that they can affect your thoughts and feelings. Calm detachment changes everything. When you respond with quiet confidence instead of emotional intensity, you remove the predictable reactions they depend on to manipulate, provoke, or control the situation. You create emotional space that they cannot easily fill. Their usual methods, such as provoking arguments, shifting blame, creating guilt, or using charm at convenient moments, suddenly lose much of their power because those strategies depend on getting a response. Without that response, the patterns supporting their sense of control begin to weaken. They often become confused and unsettled because the influence they once assumed they had is no longer guaranteed. Your calmness sends a powerful message that their emotional leverage is fading and that the relationship dynamic has fundamentally changed. Calm detachment should never be confused with giving up or becoming emotionally cold. It is an intentional and healthy way of protecting your peace. You remain respectful and present, but you are no longer available for manipulation. Your boundaries stay firm and your dignity remains intact without adding fuel to unnecessary conflict. This approach can feel deeply unsettling to someone who is used to provoking emotional reactions because they are now facing resistance that does not come with drama. Instead of arguing about your feelings, they are left facing the natural consequences of their own behavior. When they realize their usual tactics no longer produce the same results, they may begin trying different approaches. They may negotiate, appear more cooperative, or even apologize. These changes often happen not because they suddenly developed empathy, but because your calm response removed the advantage they once relied on. Quiet emotional stability changes the balance of power in a way that emotional confrontation rarely can. It makes it clear that manipulation no longer guarantees access to your attention and that their influence over your emotional life is now limited. By choosing calm detachment over emotional conflict, you protect your own well-being while creating a situation where healthier behavior becomes the only option if they want to remain part of your life. You cannot teach someone genuine empathy if they are unwilling or unable to develop it themselves, but you can completely change the way you participate in the relationship. People with strong narcissistic traits often operate from self-interest and depend heavily on outside validation instead of inner reflection. Because of this, repeatedly explaining how deeply they hurt you rarely leads to meaningful understanding. They may appear to listen, agree with your words, or even imitate concern if doing so helps them regain control of the conversation. However, real emotional understanding is often missing. Rather than trying to create empathy where it does not naturally exist, a more effective approach is changing the dynamic itself. By changing your own responses, you remove the tools they previously depended on, making it necessary for them to behave differently if they want continued access to your life. This means no longer rewarding unhealthy behavior with emotional reactions. It means consistently enforcing your boundaries so that crossing them always brings clear consequences. It means refusing to over-explain, defend yourself endlessly, or participate in conversations that only strengthen unhealthy patterns. As you do this, the balance slowly shifts back in your favor. They may not experience remorse in the traditional sense, but they often experience frustration, discomfort, and the fear of losing influence when their familiar strategies stop working. Changing your own behavior also sends a clear message that your emotional health and personal peace come first. It shows that their ability to manipulate or control you is no longer unlimited. They are forced to recognize that the old methods no longer produce the same results because you are no longer providing the emotional reactions they once relied on. As a result, they may attempt to reconnect, apologize, or temporarily adjust the way they behave. In many cases, these efforts are driven less by genuine understanding and more by the desire to preserve access, influence, or the relationship itself. By focusing on consistent boundaries, emotional detachment, and self-protection, you create an environment where unhealthy behavior is no longer rewarded. The goal is not to change who they are internally. The goal is to change how you respond, protect your well-being, and ensure that your peace is no longer controlled by someone else's actions.